What if the Black Death never happened? Picture the bells of Europe, not tolling death, but ringing for weddings, fairs and harvests that never end. No carts piled with bodies, no masked doctors, no sudden silence in the streets. People living shoulder to shoulder, markets packed, ships thick on every horizon, a world expanding without a plague to stop it. It sounds like a blessing, but would it be? Let's step back to what really happened. In the late 1340s, a disease, now known as the Black Death, most likely caused by Yersinia pestis, rode caravans and ships from Central Asia into the Mediterranean. From 1347 to 1353, it tore across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London lost a third to a half of their people. Entire villages disappeared. Priests and nobles died alongside peasants. The church struggled to answer the panic. Pogroms erupted as frightened communities hunted for scapegoats. The world felt cursed. But after the first wave passed, the survivors found themselves in a strange new economy. With fewer workers, wages rose. Serfs negotiated freedom. Landlords scrambled to keep estates running. Towns that survived saw opportunity, new guilds, new ideas, new mobility. Meanwhile, governments learned to manage crisis, taxing more efficiently, building stronger institutions, counting people, and keeping records. Venice and Ragusa pioneered quarantines, 40 days at anchor, the first crude public health policies. The chaos brought change. It didn't invent the Renaissance or the modern state, but it accelerated them, jolting Europe out of its old limits. Now, let's erase that shock. Our divergence is simple. The disease never spills into the Black Sea and Mediterranean. Maybe the flea's ecology shifts. Maybe a winter storm sinks the wrong ship. In our timeline, the spark never lands in the tinder, so Europe keeps growing. Think of the 1340s without mass graves. Families have more children. Farm fields press into forests. Every patch of land hosts someone's goats, someone's wheat. Cities swell, Paris crowded, Florence humming, London bursting at the riverbanks. But without a labor shortage, wages stay low. Lords keep their grip on serfs longer. The great bargain of the post-plague world, work your way free, arrives late, if at all. Social pressure builds quietly, like steam sealed inside iron. At first, the difference is subtle. Fewer empty houses means fewer opportunities for the landless to move in. Fewer inheritances drift into new hands. Innovation has a harder time catching fire because the incentive to save labor isn't as fierce. Why invest in a machine when workers are cheap? You still get inventors and tinkerers, but they struggle to find backers. The rhythm of change slows. And remember those quarantines? In our world, they were a breakthrough. Without the Black Death, there's no urgent reason to invent them. Ports remain porous, ships roll in and out, and city gates stay open. The idea of separating the sick from the well, of counting cases, tracking contacts, enforcing waiting periods, arrives later, only when a different crisis forces the lesson. Public health sleeps a little longer. Religion feels steadier too. The Black Death shattered trust in the clergy when prayers didn't stop the dying. In this alternate timeline, the church avoids that particular blow. Fewer panic-driven processions, fewer apocalyptic sermons, fewer witch panics rooted in disease terror, and crucially, fewer pogroms. Without the plague, many Jewish communities avoid some of the worst medieval violence. That's a mercy in this darker world we're building. Zoom out to the 100 Years' War. The plague hampered armies, emptied treasuries, and reshaped strategies. Without it, France and England field bigger forces for longer. Battles are bloodier, sieges more grinding. War taxes bite into daily life, turning markets and monasteries into counting houses. Centralized states form, yes, but they grow out of pressure to fight, not pressure to govern disaster. The apparatus of record-keeping still expands, but built to feed armies rather than to protect civilians. And the Renaissance? It still dawns because classical manuscripts still survive, scholars still travel, and patrons still crave glory. But it looks different. Think of it as a narrower light. Fewer upward paths for commoners, more art and learning confined to courts and cathedrals. With no jolt to break old hierarchies, the merchant middle class has less leverage. Even the visual culture bends away from death-obsessed imagery. Fewer dance macabres, less fixation on skulls and hourglasses.
The intricacies of this
The age still admires Rome and Athens, but the urgency to reinvent the world is muted. The spark glows. It doesn't flare. Now, shift east. The plague didn't just strike Europe. It ravaged the Islamic world and China too. If this catastrophe never rolls across Eurasia, the ripple changes power far beyond the Alps. In China, the late Yuan dynasty has one fewer stressor. Perhaps the rebellions that birthed the Ming still rise. Famine, taxes, and politics were real. But the timing changes. A stronger Yuan holding on for a few more decades alters the maritime story. The great treasure voyages that, in our history, the early Ming sent across the Indian Ocean. In this world, the decision to sail or not sail comes from a different court, at a different moment, with different incentives. There's a real chance those colossal fleets keep visiting Calicut and Hormuz longer. A Chinese-led maritime network looms larger in the 15th century, a stable bridge from East Africa to Southeast Asia. And the Ottomans? No plague wiping out towns from the Balkans to Anatolia means more soldiers, more taxes, more resilience. Constantinople may still fall in 1453, but the empire that rises afterward is healthier. The Mediterranean becomes a tighter chessboard with bigger pieces. A stronger Ottoman state holds the eastern trade gateways with a firmer hand. All of that sets the stage for Europe's next move, the Atlantic. Crowding squeezes the continent. Younger sons look across gray water for land and luck. Atlantic experiments, the caravels, the maps, the ocean gyres still appear because curiosity and profit are evergreen. But cheap labor at home slows the push for labor-saving navigation instruments and shipboard automation. The science comes, just measured in decades, not years. When the Portuguese reach West Africa and the Spanish stumble upon the Caribbean, they do so as part of a very busy world system. Not a lonely breakthrough, but a new doorway into an already bustling house. And the Americas? Here is a brutal constant. Old world diseases like smallpox still exist. Their arrival devastates indigenous populations, no matter what Europe lived through a century earlier. That tragedy remains. But two major variables shift. First, without a post-plague wage boom, European craftsmen and farmers have fewer reasons to leave home, at least at first. Migration builds more slowly until raw overcrowding pushes it higher later. Second, with the Ottomans and perhaps a more maritime China stronger for longer, European powers do not dominate global trade instantly. Colonies grow, but their supply lines and profits face stiffer competition. Meanwhile, reform in religion runs a different course. In our world, the Reformation was many things: printing press enabled, scripture focused. But it also flowed through decades of institution weariness exacerbated by plague memory and later outbreaks. In the no-plague world, the Church's moral authority is less dented. When dissent ignites, it does so within tighter boundaries. We still get reformers, still get debates over indulgences, still get vernacular Bibles, but fewer princes see a clear path to break away. Europe remains more Catholic-leaning for longer, with patchwork reforms cushioned by councils rather than shattering schisms. Literacy still rises thanks to the printing press, but religious war burns less furiously, or burns later. As cities continue to swell, the missing invention of quarantine comes back to haunt. When new epidemics, measles, typhus, influenza, flare in packed neighborhoods, governments react clumsily. They lock city gates too late, issue edicts too vague. The idea of isolating arrivals at harbors arrives only after painful lessons. A century lost in public health imagination means more chaotic outbreaks and slower growth in life expectancy. The human cost hides in parish records that no one thinks to keep carefully until bureaucracies mature for other reasons. Here's a twist. That same abundance of hands in Europe, century after century, chokes innovation in the workshop. The spinning wheel stays manual, the windmill remains unchanged, and the entrepreneur can hire 3 kids cheaper than building a new machine. Technology still advances, but the great leap, the moment a nation chooses coal, steam, and iron to multiply work, arrives late. Midway check-in. Would a world without the Black Death be kinder, or just more crowded and slower to learn? Tell me your take in the comments, and if this kind of deep dive alternate history hooks you, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next world we rewrite. Back to the map. A stronger Ottoman Empire into the 1500s and 1600s means the Eastern Mediterranean remains a hinge of wealth. Venice stays relevant longer, its spice convoys still worth fighting over. Iberian empires still grow, but their silver meets more competition and tighter choke points. The Dutch and English see opportunities, yet their ascent stretches across a longer century of rivalries instead of a rapid, decisive surge. In Asia, if a resilient Yuan morphs into a delayed Ming, or if the Ming inherits a less wounded economy, the calculus on shipbuilding changes. A court that keeps its eyes to the sea funds more expeditions, deepens ties with Malacca, and shapes rules in the Indian Ocean lanes. Arab, Gujarati, Malay, and Chinese merchants weave denser networks. When Europeans push in, they hit a well-armed, well-financed lattice of city-states and sultanates. Rather than conquer, they negotiate. Factor houses replace fortresses, treaties replace sieges. European cannons still bark, but the sound is not the only sound in the harbor. Back in Europe, revolts take on a different flavor. Without a dramatic loosening of serfdom, uprisings flare more often through the 1400s and 1500s. Short, sharp, desperate. They demand bread and lower rents rather than new political orders. This tugs states into tightening control. The modern bureaucracy emerges as a tool of tax and troop management first, citizen service second. The social contract stretches, but it creaks. Art tells the story. Without plague-haunted eyes, painters lean less on skulls and more on saints and princes. Patronage remains concentrated. The big names still carve stone and mix pigments, but fewer artisans climb to fame from workshops. Universities continue to grow, yet their gates swing open slower. The scientific method crystallizes later, perhaps during prolonged wars that force better ballistics tables and navigation charts, rather than during a burst of Renaissance curiosity. The 17th century, our real-world age of telescopes and philosophers, arrives thinner. Galileo's heirs still peer upward, but the patronage networks that support them are narrower. A delayed scientific revolution ripples forward. By the time Europe seriously embraces steam engines and mechanized looms, it's not 1760. It's closer to 1820 or even 1840. That doesn't erase the Industrial Revolution, but it moves it. British coal remains British coal. Iron still bends. But the head start that let a handful of European empires dominate half the globe shrinks. Others have time to build foundries, drill soldiers, and print newspapers. In India, Mughal strength endures deeper into the 18th century, meeting European companies not as inevitable masters, but as troublesome partners. In the Middle East, Ottoman reforms begin with more money in hand and fewer emergency fires to put out. In East Asia, whether under a late Ming or an earlier, more maritime-minded Qing, gun foundries and shipyards hum for longer without interruption. The great divergence between Europe and the rest narrows. Not gone. History rarely erases differences, but softened. Colonization still cuts and scars. The conquest of the Americas remains tragic, with disease as the sharpest blade. Yet fewer overwhelming European technological advantages mean more negotiated frontiers, more hybrid polities along coasts, and a slower inland surge. Enslavement, rooted in profit and plantation monocultures, still takes hold, though its economics shift if European labor remains abundant and cheap at home for longer. The Atlantic becomes a tangle of deals and disasters rather than a one-sided highway. By the 19th century, the old balance of power looks unfamiliar. Europe is industrializing, yes, but later and in a crowd. Steamships crisscross seas shared with Ottoman ironclads and Chinese junks retrofitted with engines. Telegraph wires hum across more than one empire's network. Revolutions for rights and constitutions still erupt, but they arrive staggered, spread across decades as pressures build slower. The map is less a European painting and more a world mosaic. And culture? Without centuries of plague memory, Europe's literature leans less into the dance with death. Fewer grim sermons, fewer frescoes of bone and sand. The existential question, what does it mean to live under a shadow, doesn't vanish, but it matures differently, pushed by war and famine instead of a single scarring epidemic. Philosophers ask new questions at new times. Medical science, arriving later to the idea of population-level prevention, still catches up, but it pays for that delay in lives during the interim. Was the Black Death then a dark engine for change? That's the unsettling heart of this thought experiment. Remove the catastrophe, and you remove its lessons. You remove waves of cruelty, yes, but you also remove a shock that broke systems open. In its place, you get a long, dense squeeze, more people, fewer opportunities, slower revolutions, stronger old empires, later new ones, a world not kinder, not harsher, but differently hard. And if you listen closely, you can hear the hinge creak. One set of ships survives a storm in the 1340s, and 600 years of history slide a few degrees. Different queens, different flags, different factories, different poems. Not a utopia, not a dystopia, just a parallel Earth where the bells never stopped. And because they never stopped, it took longer for anyone to ask why they were ringing. That's the fragile wonder of history. Each turning point is also a closed door. When we ask what if, we don't just rewrite the map. We rewrite the lessons people had to learn and how long it took to learn them. In the end, the absence of a catastrophe can be as world-changing as the catastrophe itself.